Today, we're diving into the history of how we treat diabetes. And let me tell you, it is not the straightforward story of scientific progress you might think it is. Nope. It's a story packed with deep, passionate, and often clashing beliefs that have shaped and are still shaping the lives of millions. You know, this quote from a couple of top diabetes researchers just hits the nail on the head. It perfectly sets the stage for what we're talking about. For more than a century, the argument over the right diet for diabetes has been driven way more by conviction than by actual scientific consensus. When the evidence is shaky, passion rushes in to fill that void. And that is exactly what happened here. And look, this isn't just some dusty old academic debate. This number, that's a staggering amount of money spent on the medical costs of diabetes in the US in a single year, back in 2017. That's 1 out of every $4 in the entire healthcare system. So the stakes of getting this right for people's health and for our society are just astronomically high. Okay, so to really understand the controversy today, we have to go back to a time before our modern treatments, a time when getting diagnosed with diabetes was, well, it was a death sentence. Before the 1920s, this was the grim reality. They called it a wasting disease. Patients were trapped in this unbelievably cruel paradox. They were constantly ravenously hungry, but their bodies would just wither away. They'd become frail, emaciated, until they finally slipped into a coma and died. The only real option they had was this brutal therapy called the Allen treatment, and it was, for all intents and purposes, a medically supervised starvation. You were put on these incredibly restrictive diets with fast days that were just a living nightmare. Sure, it could keep you alive a little longer, but it was a bleak, miserable existence that was really just delaying the inevitable. And then, in a lab in Toronto, in the early 1920s, something happened that would change the world forever. It was, and this is not an exaggeration, nothing short of a miracle. And the speed at which this all happened is just mind-blowing. It really kicked off with this key observation back in 1889, that the pancreas was somehow the key. A few decades later, Banting and Best finally isolate the active ingredient, what we now call insulin. And just months after that, it was already being used to save lives. Just look at this. This tells you everything you need to know about the impact. This is the story of Elizabeth Hughes, one of the very first patients. Before insulin, she's 14 years old, weighs just 45 pounds, and can barely even walk. But after just 6 weeks of treatment, she'd gained 20 pounds, she'd grown taller, and she was eating things like toast for the first time in years. I mean, the transformation was just stunning. So you have to understand, this didn't feel like just another treatment. It felt like a cure. All of a sudden, the body's fundamental problem could be fixed. Patients could eat carbs again, they could get their strength back, they could literally step back from the brink of death into a life filled with hope again. But here's where the story takes a fascinating and, honestly, a really complicated turn. This miracle cure, it didn't end the debate. No, it created a brand new conflict that is still dividing the medical world to this day. So, two totally opposite philosophies popped up. On one side, you had a group saying, hey, let's stick with what we know works. Restrict the carbs, keep the blood sugar stable, and use as little insulin as possible. But the other side saw this incredible new freedom. They said, why not eat a normal, high-carb diet and just use insulin to cover it? And this became the central question that would define diabetes care for the next 100 years. It sounds so simple, right? If you've got the antidote, why should you be afraid of the poison? Well, that very question set the stage for decades of conflicting advice, patient confusion, and medical controversy. Now, this whole debate wasn't happening in a bubble. A massive cultural shift in public health was about to come along and tip the scales hard in one direction. After World War II, the entire nation became gripped by the fear of heart disease. You had influential researchers, powerful groups like the American Heart Association, and they all started pointing the finger at one culprit: dietary fat. And pretty soon, official government guidelines were recommending a low-fat, high-carb diet for everybody. For the diabetes debate, this was basically a knockout blow for the low-carb approach. And this quote just captures the moment perfectly. By the 1970s, the low-fat message was so dominant that when a prominent scientist suggested to the U.S. Congress that maybe sugar was the problem, not fat, a U.S. senator was genuinely shocked. It went against everything the public and their doctors had been told to believe for years.
So that brings us to the modern era, where a quiet technological revolution began to chip away at decades of medical dogma by putting data, for the first time, directly into the hands of the patients themselves.
What sounds totally routine to us now was a radical, revolutionary idea back then. For the very first time, patients didn't have to just blindly trust their doctor's advice and wait for an occasional lab test. They could see for themselves, day by day, even hour by hour, how their bodies were actually responding. This was the beginning of a massive shift in power. Okay, now fast forward to today with technology like continuous glucose monitors, or CGMs. It's a whole new ballgame. That feedback loop is now instant. It's undeniable. You can eat a bowl of oatmeal and then literally watch on your phone as your blood sugar graph climbs. This tech makes that abstract connection between food and your body's response intensely personal and impossible to ignore. This story, wow, it's just so powerful. You have this 9-year-old kid, Dave, just diagnosed, and he has this simple, logical thought. If carbs make my blood sugar go up, I'll just stop eating them. And the experts, the doctors, and even his own dad, they laughed at him. But after months of struggling to follow the official high-carb advice, his parents used their own data and realized their 9-year-old son had been right all along. And that leaves us right here with this final, incredibly important question. In an age where you and I can gather more data on our own bodies than ever before in history, what happens when that personal, real-world evidence clashes with decades of official medical advice? This is the new frontier in the long, complicated, and controversial story of diabetes. And it's a question that puts the power and the burden of choice squarely back on the patient.